How do you convince somebody that Christianity is right? Well, there's coercion, conversion, conquest. How do you
Example.
Sorry?
Example.
Okay.
That's an important one.
Okay. I'll have to think on that some more, because a lot of the things that people do that they think are exemplary or examples of Christianity, I don't think that they're in any way not necessarily tied to Christianity. Like, it's not, there's nothing a Christian could do that is good that I couldn't also do. And so the example thing doesn't work. But with secular humanism, it is through debate, discussion, data, and convincing people. It's not like we're running around saying, we're going to conquer and install this here. We're not going to make a proclamation that we have the one true right answer. The position that secular humanism takes is, as far as we can tell, we get one life. If there's more, hey, bonus, show us, we'll be convinced. It seems that we are, as human beings, as agents, stuck here trying to figure out the best way to live this life. And so we must rely on ourselves and not make appeals to supernatural agents that we can't demonstrate or that don't seem to intervene on our behalf. And if they exist, they're free to come in and step up and tell us where we're doing it wrong. But for now, we're just going to try to do the best we can with what we have to make the world a better place. That's the foundation of secular humanism, not any proclamation that we've got it right.
So I would say that the primary religious language, insofar as there is such a thing, it's something I tried to detail in Maps of Meaning. It's the first book I wrote. It's a very complicated book. But religious propositions are, in some sense, abstracted generalizations about what being consists of and how to act in it. It's not the same thing as a set of hypotheses about material reality. And it's partly because in the religious domain, the moral imperative is primary, whereas in the empirical domain, the factual domain is primary, or the sensory domain is primary, something like that. So the question from the religious perspective is something like, how should we best construe the world if we wish to determine how to act properly within it? And the way that language is developed, it's developed as a consequence of an evolutionary process, both biological and cultural. And it's culminated in a set of stories, essentially, that have characters. The characters basically represent something like the permanently unknowable. And so that's the mystery that surrounds us all. And that would be associated, say, with the potential of the future and the potential in you. The part of being that's transcendent, right, that constantly escapes from your theorizing. That's the unknown. It's like unexplored territory for animals. And it's a permanent part of being. So there's unexplored territory, the unknown, and there's explored territory, culture, the known, and that's this room, and that's the cultural mores that unite us well enough so that we can all sit here and be peaceful while we're discussing difficult things. So that's the landscape, the religious landscape. That's yin and yang. That's chaos and order. Interestingly enough, it looks like it's to that landscape that our brain has adapted, because the right hemisphere looks like it's roughly responsible for processing chaos and the unknown, and the left hemisphere roughly responsible for processing the known and the familiar. And that's on good evidence. If you don't want to take my word for it, you can read Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, which is quite masterful treatment of the neuropsychological literature. And so that's the religious domain, yin and yang, chaos and order. And it places human beings at the center of that. And the idea is that we're always confronted by what we understand and have to adapt to that, even in its tyrannical manifestation. And we're always faced with the permanent reality of the permanently incomprehensible that can burst into our life at any moment and disrupt it. That's reality. And then the religious question is, if that's reality, how do you orient yourself in relationship to those two permanent domains? And the answer to that is something like, pursue the instinct of meaning. Because it looks like meaning is the instinctive response neuropsychologically grounded in the orienting reflex, I would say, which is a very primordial reflex to the unknown. Meaning is the response that orients us in that world. And so when we're engaged in a meaningful enterprise, it's a signal from the deepest elements of our biological being that we have the balance between what we know and makes us secure and what we don't know and have yet to explore properly synced. And that makes us secure, but not totalitarian, and engaged, but not terrified. And by staying on that midpoint of balance, that's Tao, by the way, that's the way from the Taoist perspective. By staying on that midpoint, we do what's best for us, what's best for our families, what's best for our community, and God only knows beyond that. We do all of that simultaneously, and we can tell that we're doing that. It speaks to us when we're doing that. And that's the deepest of religious instincts. And it's that capability to orient on that border between chaos and order that's exemplified in great mythological heroes like St. George, who goes out to slay the dragon, or Christ, who welcomes death, who embraces mortality and vulnerability and strives forward nonetheless. And there's nothing outside of the religious language that communicates that kind of grandeur. There's nothing that you can use to communicate to people who are in the direst of straits what's most important about life in the manner that will help set them straight and put their soul at peace. So that's the advantage of the religious language.
Well, there's coercion, conversion, conquest. How do you
Example.
Sorry?
Example.
Okay.
Example. 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 Example.
Whether or in order for the values to
That's exactly why you said before that the Enlightenment couldn't have just sprung out of nothing, right? I mean, that's exactly what you were saying, that it needed all of the bedrock.
Well, and I would
that.
think that for people who are fundamental evolutionary biologists, and I kept trying to make this case to, well, you can make a case like that to Pinker and the psychologist, but also to Harris. It's like, where do you guys get off thinking that this is a consequence of the last 300, 400 years?
Right.
It's like, we're looking at time spans. Even the Enlightenment figures, they lived in a world that was like 6,000 years old. We're living in a world that's 3.5 billion years old. You have to extend your thinking about the origins of phenomena like morality way back past the Enlightenment. And so this adventure thing, this is a good example of the wisdom that's embedded in those myths. So like, I didn't know that much about...
And I will say, sorry, to just pause for a second, and I would say in that history, specifically because as a point of belief, I do believe that this is a historical circumstance. And whether you call it myth or history, as long as you believe the reality of myth, and you and I believe in reality in different ways, and this is part of the fundamental distinction, because my understanding is that your understanding of what is true and what is real is an almost a quasi-utilitarian Charles Peirce view of because you recommended me the book. So, but my view is much more like Sam's in the sense that most religious people believe the objective truth about historical myth, right? But when it comes to getting beyond that question, then I think we're in almost complete agreement.
The strange thing is, too, with these mythological stories is that, like, there are forms of abstraction that are more true than what they're abstracted from, right? Mathematics is like that, and I'm going to do a bunch of lectures on Exodus, and I think the Mosaic story is a really interesting example of that. It's like, what a good piece of, here's a kind of truth. This is literary truth. And it's true, is that, well, this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and there was a pattern about what happened. Let's call that the heroic pattern, for lack of a better word. And so the question is, well, what's the reality? Is the reality the specifics of what happened in each person's individual life, or is it the general pattern that manifested itself across all those people? And I would say, if you want to extract out guidelines for proper living, then the reality is the abstraction that's pulled out of the multiple stories. And so even if the story of Moses is a composite story in some sense, that doesn't mean it's not true. It's true the way, and this is something that I could never make headway with regards to Sam. It's like, well, is there literary truth? Well, there better be, because otherwise, what is the use of literature, and how do you rank order literature in terms of quality if there's no standard of truth? Well, what's the truth? Well, it's an abstraction. And if you don't think that abstractions are true, then you're not thinking, because you can easily make a case that a proper abstraction is more real than the thing from which it's abstracted. You certainly make that case with mathematics. And so these stories, it's not only that they have pragmatic utility, although I try to explain things biologically when I can do that, it's that that utility is true in the broader sense that we've been describing truth. And so the Abrahamic story with the call to adventure is very interesting. So, and it's something else that I've been lecturing to my audiences about. It's, well, what's the purpose of life? Well, it's an adventure. Well, where do you see that? Well, you see that in the Abrahamic story in particular, because Abraham's this guy who fails to launch, right? He's 80 and he's still in his father's tent, and God says, you know,
get up.
Well, and that's the call, right? What is that? You think, well, there's a call to adventure. Well, there is a call to adventure. Young men die without that call to adventure. That's what attracts them to ISIS, for God's sake, is the call to adventure, right? And you could say, well, that's warped and twisted in those individuals because the society hasn't canalized that into the proper channels, right? It hasn't given them a moral equivalent to war in William James terms. It hasn't called them out properly. But God calls out Abraham, and all that happens to Abraham to begin with is that he encounters a famine and a tyranny and a conspiracy to steal his wife. Like, it's a bloody catastrophe. And you think, oh, I see. Well, it isn't that God is calling you out to happiness. He's calling you out to the great adventure of your life, right? And that comes along with the suffering and the burden and the malevolence and all of that. And so it's something grand and noble, like a seafaring expedition on the high seas. It's not that impulsive, self-gratifying, immediate happiness that seems to be, what would you say, the obsession of our current culture.
Yeah, so I'm glad it's a call to physical adventure that I think people are lacking right now. But I think it's also a call to spiritual adventure in the sense that you are supposed to see how your values stack up against reality. I mean, this is the most famous story of Abraham. Well, the most famous story is the sacrifice of Isaac, and in that story, my view of that story is that I've never found that story particularly puzzling. A lot of people find that story particularly puzzling because God saying, you know, go sacrifice your son. But to me, what he's actually saying is the fundamental truth. That story is the fundamental truth of raising a child and committing to something. Because what God is actually saying to Abraham is you have to put your child at risk of death to live for a certain set of values. And then Abraham has enough faith to say, and I trust that God is not actually going to kill my child, but by committing to this set of values, I am in fact putting my child at risk of death.
Because you're putting your child in the world.
Yes, that's right.
And not only that, you're doing so on behalf of your family. You're doing so on behalf of your God. You're doing so on behalf of a broader purpose. And by the way, this is what it means to be, I think, an emissary, a fighter and a soldier and an emissary for the West. I think this is true particularly, you know, as a Jew. I think this has always been true of Jews because here's the reality. Every time my son is born, 8 days later we circumcise him. We take a baby and we pre-commit him. And we say, this is going to be your life now. Your life is, I am pre-committing you. This is me doing, you know, what Abraham did to Isaac. I am putting my child in more danger by circumcising him and making him a Jew than I would otherwise be, because Jews are at a lot more danger in the world than other people.
It's a messy history.
But that's the point, is that I'm saying to my child, I pre-commit you to this struggle. I pre-commit you to this set of values, and that does put you at additional risk. But that's also what gives you meaning. And throughout Jewish history, sometimes God doesn't find the ram in the thicket, right? Sometimes there is no ram in the thicket. Sometimes the kids die.
Right.
Okay, that is the reality of life, and it's also the reality of committing to any value system worth committing to.
It's so interesting because I don't know that I've heard you talk about this in the lectures, this specific issue through the biblical lens, but this is so consistent with everything else you talk about.
I just thought it'd be like when the Olympics start.
Hey, look, if rituals are important.
Yeah, thank you.
And if this is a ritual that's important
Okay,
to you,
so
then I'm happy to comply.
Rip it fat.
Okay, so I just breathe in.
Yeah, breathe in. I got the button. Fat rips. Nice. You're good. Yeah, you get it. Damn, you know how to keep it in. That's a man's ways. Well done. I will clap.
I sing a song, then I came back down the mountain. All the while, big moon above me, old coyote laughing at me. song that I came back down the mountain. All the while, big moon above me. Old coyote was laughing at me when singing saw cutting down a willow. Thought I saw a singing saw cut down a song tree. Thought I saw a singing saw cutting down a willow. Then I saw the singing saw come singing after me. Got a songbird in my head, up the hill so I could get rid of it. Got a songbird in my head, past the houses so I could put it down. Singing song